right. For today's topic is going to be something that's very near and dear to my heart, is Indigenous Peoples Day. So excuse me, October 12th is Indigenous Peoples Day. We're going to discuss it. So the what, Indigenous Peoples Day, the how, our agenda, who are the Indigenous, times they went through wars, removal, and termination, Indigenous people in North Carolina and up in Oregon where I lived, and mascot controversies. And why? Because we talk about Columbus Day, which we shouldn't. And we talk about all these other things, but we really ignore the people that are actually from America, the United States, or indigenous people. So indigenous means originating or occurring naturally in a place, or native. Who are the indigenous people, right? Those first migrants who came across the Bering Land Bridge at the time, which is now the Bering Land Strait. They settled as far north as Alaska and all the way south as Argentina. There are 574 federally recognized tribes. Indigenous culture, the history and culture spread from the elders to younger generations through stories and dance. You can see some warriors here. Pocahontas, the story was all wrong, right? She didn't even marry John Smith. She marries John Rolfe in real life. She eventually does live in England. They used her posters to sell voyages all over the world, but she was actually had really, really short hair, and she wore a wig. Because at the time, Native women had very short hair in her tribe. Wars, removal, and termination, a variety of historic policy periods impacted the American Indian people and their abilities to self-govern. So there's a colonization period, right, 1492 through, up until 1789 or so, or really just since. The treaty period, which was from our American Revolution through our Civil War. The removal period, which was the Indian Removal Act, which led to the Trail of Tears. There was allotment and assimilation, just post-Civil War up until about World War II. Tribal reorganization, which was all the way through the Korean War, terminating the tribes, which happened all the way through 1988, and then self-determination, which started in the mid-70s and continued on. Now, the French and Indian War is a very popular war. It's called the 7 Years' War, French Indian War. The British and the French, excuse me, British and the French had a war, and they used Native American tribes in it. The Indian Removal Act followed the Seminole Wars, where General Andrew Jackson really got his fame, right? And then he's the president who instituted the Indian Removal Act and started the first reservations all the way out in Oklahoma. You can see the path here. At least 3,000 Native Americans died on the Trail of Tears, the original one. And there were more. Termination, which happened in the 50s through the 80s. They tried to assimilate tribes, which basically means they wanted to have it where Native American people just fell right in and they were no longer Native Americans. So they got rid of their tribal status. They were no longer considered Native Americans or indigenous folk. North Carolina indigenous peoples, you can see the different tribes over here on the left. You can see where they live in this area and where the different trails have been established. Here you can see that 1% of the North Carolina population is made up of what we call indigenous or Native Americans, which is really, really high. East of Mississippi is actually the highest. The story of Grand Ronde, where my wife worked and where we lived up in that area, the tribes of Grand Ronde existed for thousands of years. Confederate tribes were forced off their land in the 1800s. They had a new reservation, which was part of a Trail of Tears, created in 1856. Then there was a second issue after, in 1954. They decided to terminate them to get their land because it was filled with fish and timber, and so they were terminated again. And in 1983, ancestors of the CTGR were given restoration. You can read Catherine Karen Harrison's story. Sovereignty is the act of having an independent power or being free. And so CTGR is made up of the Shasta, Rogue River, Umpqua, Malava, and Kalapuya tribes. In Grand Ronde, for instance, the tribe has annual powwows, cultural events, and the Chinook Wawa language is taught at the local high school. And I'm actually learning a little bit of it. CTGR does still have some tribal land and police and things like that. You can see here powwows, film, and the app, and even an indigenous person on Sesame Street. In the end, are you surprised by the government's behavior with regards to indigenous people? Have a good day.